Okay, thank you everyone for staying with us until now because we do have a very, very interesting presentation from Doug Madory on the ROV adoption in the Middle East. Doug is one of the superstars in the internet measurements area. He's the director of internet analysis for Kentik, where he works on internet infrastructure analysis. The Washington Post they dub him the man who can see the internet. That comes for his reputation in identifying significant developments in the structure of the internet. And if you are following anything related to internet shutdowns, you will know exactly what I mean. He always on top of all these things. Doug is regularly quoted by major news outlets about developments ranging from national blackouts to BGP hijacks, and also the activation of submarine cables and so on. Prior to Kentik, he was the lead analyst for Oracle's Internet Intelligence team. May it rest in peace. Doug.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's been a while. This isn't my first MENOG, but it's been a long time since I've been here. My first MENOG was here in Oman 13 years ago. And so it's been a while since I've been back. It's neat to see what things have changed, and then there's other things that haven't changed. So this is another talk about RPKI. It'll be a little different than the previous discussions, but I hope you find this interesting. So in this discussion, let's start with an anecdote of an incident that took place at the beginning of this year. So on January 3rd, Orange España, is a mobile operator in Spain, suffered an outage. They were down for a couple of hours, and when the dust settled, we figured out what had happened. It had to do with RPKI ROV, in fact. So a hacker had gained access to the RIPE NCC account of this provider. The credentials were found in an info stealer malware dump. The password was RIPE admin, maybe not the strongest one, and this was at the time when RIPE NCC did not mandate two-factor authentication. That was instituted globally within about a day as a result of this attack. But when the attacker got into the account of Orange España, they started tinking around, trying to figure out what is it they could do to mess with this network. And the thing that this person settled on was trying to create some ROAs that were intentionally incorrect, to cause their routes to be invalid, to find out, to hopefully cause some disruption, and that it did. This was the first time we saw RPKI ROV get utilized as a denial of service attack, and it might be a surprising anecdote to include in an RPKI ROV story, but I think the thing we'll talk about as far as adoption goes, what's one takeaway from me looking at this was, there's a lot of debate about how much invalid routes get rejected. Well, this outage could not have taken place without a significant number of ASs rejecting invalid routes. All right, so let's talk about RPKI ROV adoption. So as was stated earlier, the way the system works is we've got a step one where the resource owner creates a route origin authorization to state what is the correct state of routing. And then there's a separate step where ASs will use that information to reject announcements that don't conform to the information contained in the ROA. The ROA simply is just the proper origin and also the max prefix length, although that part is not required, it's actually optional. So let's talk about these two steps and what we can see. So this is a graphic that I used, I guess from NIST. It's a US federal agency that does technical standards, and they have a team that studies routing security, and that team also maintains a website that's called RPKI Monitor, I think, and has a lot of statistics that it maintains, and one is this graph where it's looking at how many routes in the global routing table have got ROAs. And so in this case, we're looking at the V4 global routing table, and there's a clear trend, there's an inflection point around 2020 where the green line, these are routes with ROAs, starts creeping up. And the yellow line are routes without ROAs, starts heading downwards. And then along the x-axis, there's a red line of all of the persistently invalid routes due to misconfigurations. At any given time, there's a handful of them. We'll come back to that later in the talk. But I was writing this with a joint work I did with Joop Snijders at Fastly. And at that time, we were projecting like, well, the lines are pretty straight, and it looks like they might cross sometime next year. And if they hold steady, it may be May 2014. And I even posted this on Twitter and LinkedIn to see what people thought among my other BGP nerd friends. And honestly, the pessimism was high and kind of unwarranted, I think, in my opinion. In fact, had I added a fifth option of like never in these surveys, I think that probably would have been maybe the most popular one. Of course, it wasn't that bad. In fact, we did cross this milestone where the number of routes that have ROAs May 1st, as projected, and that's for V4. V6 actually achieved this over a year ago, I think partly due to the fact that it lacks a lot of the legacy baggage that V4 has. It's a little ahead of the curve on this. So counting routes is one thing, and we've seen that a couple times today, or IP address space. So I work at a company that has a lot of NetFlow traffic. So we do NetFlow analytics for service providers, hosting companies, gaming companies, content providers, enterprises. We have a lot of different types of companies that send NetFlow to us. We process it. That's our business. And so that gives me access to a large slice of the internet traffic at any given time. And one thing that's unique is a feature that we had built a couple of years ago to try to help enable RPKI ROV adoption, was that when NetFlow records are ingested, we decorate it with a lot of attributes. But one of those is we'll do a RPKI evaluation from the perspective of the router that sent it to us at that time. And that gives us an idea of, to put this RPKI evaluation in terms of traffic volume. And so that's what I decided to do a couple of years ago, and I was poking around at this and was surprised to find that at that time, this is for a talk at now maybe 2.5 years ago, we were at about 1/3 of the BGP routes had ROAs, but it was over half, well, just a little bit over half of the traffic in bits per second that went to routes with ROAs, and therefore was eligible for the protection that ROV would provide. That was a bit of a surprise. We were maybe better, farther along than we had thought, at least by that metric. And if you dig into that, and I talk about it in that talk from a while back, this had to do with the fact that we had major deployments, RPKI deployments for eyeball networks and content providers. So these are the two players in the internet ecosystem that are pushing and pulling the most amount of traffic. And so they're going to have an outsized influence when we look at traffic volume versus just counting IP addresses or routes, because not every route is created equal. There's routes out there that carry no traffic. And so we don't want to, it would be great if we could not count those. So my quest this year was to look at, well, how has this changed in the couple of years since then? And so I mentioned a moment ago that we crossed this threshold of going into the majority case of V4 routes with ROAs. And I want to put that in terms of traffic. We're like, all right, well, if the number of routes have improved, then we should see some kind of improvement with the traffic. And this is the latest stats that I calculated with our data. Back in October 2024, a couple months ago, that we're at just under 3/4 of the volume of traffic sent around the world going to routes with ROAs. Again, this is coming from RPKI deployments, mostly from eyeball networks, content providers. But we are approaching perhaps I would predict we're going to plateau at some point, because some of these future gains are going to be hard won. But it's kind of a success story as far as the deployment of this mechanism. And also, when these are stats for RPKI in the Middle East. So I just ran these numbers this past week. This is again just looking at a 1-week look back. And so for each of these countries, we've got 2 bars here, and the red is the IP space I grabbed from RipeStat, at least the latest stats I could find. which are all pretty high. The traffic levels are also pretty high. This is, when I took all the traffic to all these countries and looked at it, we're seeing it like 93%. We looked at 73 a minute ago for the world, but 93% when going to the Middle East is going to routes with ROAs. That's huge. In fact, this region made, I haven't checked other regions, but I can't imagine there's another region that's as saturated with or covered with ROAs as this one. One comment about the cases when the two bars differ. So in the case, most of these are the same, but take like Kuwait is probably the biggest difference here, where you've got the red bars quite a bit less than the blue. And then what that means is that from our perspective, from our customers sending traffic into Kuwait, we're seeing a lot more going to, almost all of it going to routes with ROAs versus, and so that means there must be some address space that is routed that doesn't have a ROA that also isn't carrying any traffic. And so that's, in my opinion, kind of the benefit of having a traffic perspective, because then we don't nearly need to worry about that potentially, because that's, there's less traffic to get disrupted. All right, so the ROAs alone are useless if we don't have any networks rejecting invalids. And so again, looking back at analysis I started with Joe back in 2022, we were looking at, trying to come up with some ways of figuring out this side of the equation. And there's been a number of attempts to look at this. Cloudflare did one also where they tried to measure individual ASs that are rejecting valids. I kind of wanted to punt on the question of being able to determine that each AS, whether each AS is rejecting or not. I'd like to know the macro impact of that. And we arrived at that analysis by looking at all of the route views data for a day and just evaluating all of it based on the RPKI or ROAs of that day. And we came up with this graphic here where what's happening is in the blue are routes without ROAs, the orange is things that are that do have ROAs and are evaluated as valid, and then the green is invalid. And what ends up happening is in each of these graphs, we've got V4 on the left and V6 on the right, although the story is essentially the same. The x-axis is the number of BGP sources in route views, and the y-axis is the count of routes. So you end up with these peaks of routes that are globally routed, basically seen by everybody. And so there's very little difference or no difference between those that are not found and valid. In each case, the routes are not being filtered. And then at the bottom, we have the RPKI invalid routes. And I mentioned earlier, there's always these persistently invalid routes at any given time, mostly due to misconfigurations. So I'm using those to try to help measure like how far are those propagating. And for the system to work, we want that distribution to be pushed all the way to the left, meaning that these routes don't propagate very far and they have less opportunity to cause disruption if it's been identified as a bad route because it's RPKI invalid. So I took the invalid distribution at the bottom and looked at these through time. So again, looking at using historical RPKI data and route views data through time, we can see that there's kind of a bouncing curve that's auguring, down in a downward fashion. It's a 24% decline if we accept that methodology. I mean, there are some challenges here where that persistently invalid set of routes is not guaranteed to stay the same, and where a route gets announced in the world really makes a difference on how it propagates. But so to validate this, we decided to look at these RPKI invalid beacons that are out there. So both RIPE NCC and Job operates his own set of beacons. RIPE NCC has beacons for a lot of things, some turn on and off. They've also got ones for studying RPKI. And in this case, we're looking at, again, how far have these routes propagated over these couple of years. And so then the y-axis is the BGP sources, so a measure of propagation, and then the x-axis is time. So we can see on these upper plots that the lines are kind of creeping up. That's partly due to the route views data set slowly growing, and these are things that are not being filtered. They're just, so it's a measure of the overall set, the data set. And then the graphs along the bottom are routes that are slowly decreasing in propagation. So we can see that these things are, the propagation is going down for invalids. That is, again, a measure of health and progress as far as RPKI, ROV adoption goes. This is from a global perspective. One thing you can see, if you look very closely in Job's beacons, there's two separate lines in the invalids section. And so what's happening there is that he's got two hosted. One appears in the Aran tal and one appears in the Ripe tal. And the purpose is to try to measure the difference or the effect of the legal issues around the Aran tal. So there's a relaying party agreement that has a lengthy, has a legal process to accept. Not every provider accepts it, and so you end up with some providers who reject invalids, don't use the Aran data. This is a small portion, but it's noticeable because there's a bit of space between these two plots, where the upper one is the one in Aran, meaning that the invalid route has propagated a little farther than had it been just announced or had it appeared in the Ripe tal. It's something for the Aran folks to work out still. And at the beginning of this year, I think, depending on your definition of Tier 1 AS, and we can debate that forever, I think we were down to maybe two networks that were Tier 1s that were not rejecting invalids. And these Tier 1s that reject invalids, these guys cast long shadows, and they have a lot of benefit downstream benefit to their customer cone by rejecting invalids. In fact, that's largely, I estimate, much of the impact that we're seeing with how little invalids propagate is due to some of the bigger providers. And so we had Zio this year in April begin rejecting invalids. It may be a little hard to see in this graphic here, but in there's a little red highlight in the middle of the graphic showing the disappearance of Zio as an upstream for this RPKI invalid route, reducing its propagation, and also, it's not being carried by Zio anymore. So that leaves us just with Telecom Italia Sparkle, with the only Tier 1 that's still carrying invalids. Maybe they'll address that soon, but the overall the impacts are pretty substantial. So the flip side of it is, as I do some of this work, I'll come across networks with persistently invalid routes. We even have a little process where we will, programmatically find these, even write up a little email. A lot of times what ends up happening is they've misconfigured the max prefix length, and maybe it made sense when they created the ROA, and now routing has changed, and all of a sudden now they're invalid, and the routes are getting filtered, and they're not, aware of this problem, I guess. But so we let networks know, and this is an example of one where you can kind of see on the graphic on the left here, the moment that Globe Telecom out of the Philippines has made the correction to their ROAs. One thing that's a common mistake here is that the max prefix length that's in a ROA is an optional field. You can just match on the origin. And so what ends up happening, this is where people get in trouble. They put in the max prefix length, they change routing in the future, and they go back and change it. What was interesting here is, again, having access to NetFlow. We can look at, this was actually traffic from a couple dozen of these routes that they fixed at the same time. We can see that there's an uptick in traffic. So that means one of two things. Either they were having some connectivity problems that they didn't know about or weren't addressing that got fixed once this traffic came through. Or the other possibility is that all the internet scanners that are out there scanning stuff now finally had access to this address space that was not accessible until they fixed the ROA. So maybe that was some unwelcome traffic that they're now having to handle. But there's, like I said, we use these invalid routes for measurement, but it'd be great if we could get them all addressed and fixed. So coming back to the Orange España attack, we had this hacker gain access to the right NCC account and create ROAs. Orange España had never created a ROA up until that point. Now they have 100% coverage and they're fully on board. By creating these ROAs, rendering their routes invalid, then it dropped traffic, and this wouldn't happen if there weren't a substantial amount of ASs that are rejecting invalids. I say this call to action. Usually I have this kind of thing in talks about RPKI, ROV. In this region, like I said, you're way ahead of the curve, and so good for you. I guess the last step is the rejecting invalids. That's something left to be done for a lot of networks, but these percentages in the 90s are amazing. I would just leave with a couple thoughts here. So, RPKI ROV does not solve all of the routing security issues. This is a beginning. This is really just to address the fat finger mistakes, origination leaks, things that happen with a regular basis. I mean, I don't think people are quite aware that this is still happening. There are still leaks. They're just not causing disruption. If we think about, I often ask the audience to try to come up with what was the last debilitating routing leak, and people go back to like June 2019 of the Verizon, Cloudflare, Allegheny Tech leak. That's a long time ago in internet times. Now we're talking about 5.5 years, and it's not an accident. There's a lot of things besides RPKI ROV. There's IR filtering, peer lock. But even, I'll just mention a couple other success stories. There's one thing that's tough as a storyteller is to talk about these non-events that haven't taken place. So in October of this year, Brazil banned Twitter, X. I forget the reason, but they gave the order, the government gave the order down to ISPs to find a way to block, and there was a handful of ISPs that actually used BGP to hijack Twitter, black hole it just within the country. But one of them leaked these routes out of the country in a scenario that we'd seen both in the aftermath of the military coup in Myanmar and then in Russia after they were cracking down on independent media following the invasion of Ukraine. A provider would use BGP to black hole Twitter, the route leaks out and causes disruption outside the country. In this case, the only routes that left the country were those without ROAs. I don't know the intricacies of the Twitter network, but evidently those were not necessary for running the service because there was no disruptions outside of the country. So in each of those cases, those are cases where you've got an intentional hijack that leaks out and becomes kind of accidental. It's both intentional and accidental, but those impacts are limited and constrained to the region where they came from. And again, that's another anecdote of the system working. So right now, I think the folks that think about this stuff, we're looking at these different adversary scenarios, mostly with the cryptocurrency attacks that have been happening over the last couple of years. And we have to build off this progress we've built with ROV to look at things like ASPA, BGP-SEC, and so forth. So with that, I'll take any questions you may have. All right. Thanks.